Yeah, well, number one, remember they said that they are the original Jews, and they tend to refer to themselves as Jews. And so that word is all the way through the New Testament. But the thing is, the word Essene is a Greek word that means healer. And that's basically what the Greek people would call them. The Hebrew people would call them the sons of Zadok, or there's the priest, that kind of thing, which is interesting if you think about it. You've got the real Zadok priests that are supposed to be ruling, and you've got this cult that comes up that takes over. So what do? They call themselves Sadducee or Zadoki, trying to convince people they are the real Zadok priests and not. So you see that kind of stuff in there. So other than that, it's not mentioned a whole lot because I think mainly when you give a name to someone, you're doing it because there's a problem. We're all Jews. We're waiting for Messiah. That's all we need to know, except that nut over there. So we got to give him a name, a Sadducee, a Pharisee, a Samaritan. Samaritans might be nice people, but they only took like the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They reject everything else. Okay, they're nuts. It's just so we're going to call them this name, we're going to call them that name, not in a bad way, but just to label them. So you've got this, but you've got a lot of Essenes. For instance, in Acts chapter, I think it's chapter 13, it's when the prophets came down from Antioch to lay hands on Barnabas and Paul and anoint them for ministry. It says that there were 3 major guys that came down. One of them was in our Bible, it says Manaen, who was the Manaen who was with Herod in his household. Okay, so that tells us everything we need to know. The Hebrew way of saying that name is Menachem, and there's a whole history of Menachem the Essene, how he ran the Sanhedrin, and then when they began to apostatize, he said, "No, I'm keeping the original teaching, and I leave." And so they call him a heretic. He leaves and kind of disappears, and that's when Hillel takes over. So Hillel and Shammai, 2 of the main famous rabbis. But what's happens is, of course, he's a Christian. He's waiting, and he comes down at this point. He's got to be at least in his 90s or 100, 102, something like that, at least, to anoint Paul, coming down from Antioch all the way to Jerusalem. And it's interesting because they're called Essenes, meaning healers, but they have this concept that if you do the herbal medicine and you have a simple lifestyle and you dedicate yourself to the Lord, you normally live to be 120. That's just kind of standard. Almost all of them do. The Pharisees and Sadducees might live to be 70 or 80 if they have a really cushy, place and lots of good food and that kind of stuff. The average Gentile lived to be about 60 back in that day, is from what we understand. So you've got this 90-year-old guy hopping on a donkey and coming all the way down here to anoint Paul. And it's just interesting to see that. He's got to have an Essene diet. He's got to have a long lifespan. He's filled with the Holy Spirit. So obviously he's a Christian. Otherwise he wouldn't be filled with the Spirit and still prophesying. And so that goes along with what the church fathers say about after the coming of Messiah. It doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, but you have to be a believer in Messiah to experience the gifts. So that's just one example, but there's others in there, and I think we get stuck on the names sometime. Scribes, by the way, is there's a couple of different kinds of scribes. Some scribes they might be referring to Essenes. Other scribes are the ones that just write court documents, scribes. And then there was a scribal group or denomination that I thought was fascinating because the Pharisees said we're going to follow this oral Torah. And the Essenes would say oral Torah is junk because we have the writings of the patriarchs. So we're following patriarchal history in the Old Testament. The scribes, on the other hand, said we're not going to take sides in that. So we're not going to look at any history, any theology. We're just going to read the Bible and take wild guesses on what we think it means. And I thought it's interesting when you look at it like that, Jesus was always yelling at the scribes and the Pharisees, they're hypocrites. And you can see why. It's like you're trying to teach real history, teach everything correctly, but you don't want to look at history and add it to the Bible or anything like that. So it's really interesting to see. And we kind of have that parallel today in our society. People will say, well, let's not look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's not in the Bible, but it's mentioned. It's part of history. It's kind of important.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and yeah, it is important. And Also, if it was included in the Bible would be so big nobody would have the time to read it. I mean,
Right.
it's already hard enough to even get Christians to read the Bible with the length. Imagine if it was twice or three times the size. Something that the Dead Sea Scrolls do, which is really interesting, is they provide commentaries on biblical texts that we're familiar with, and in some of those commentaries, there's a lot of prophecy that can be found. And you dedicated a whole section of your book to prophetic commentaries. I'd love to go through some of these and just have you talk about what you found in these commentaries that really stuck out. So let's start with the Genesis commentary. What's in there and what stuck out to you prophetically?
Well, number one, they go through and they give us chapter 7 of Genesis, the flood account and everything, but they will plug in the actual dates. Our Genesis says that the flood occurred on the 17th of the second month in the 600th year of Noah's life. So that's ER 1656 on the calendar. But they would actually go so far as to say, well, that day was Sunday, and it was this, and it was that. So they give you all the days of the week, all that kind of stuff. If their calendar is correct, and that's the one that has always been used, those dates would be absolutely correct. So it's really neat to see that kind of stuff. And when you look at prophecies and comments and other scriptures, that corroborates it. So, for instance, I've always wondered when Jesus said something happens and 3 days later this other thing happened, why does it say 3 days later? Because I have no clue when it started. There's no way I could figure out when it happened. It's a waste of time. There's no way to figure it out. If you use the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, you'll know exactly what day it is. If it's a festival or if it's close to a Sabbath or whatever, it just clicks. And so it makes sense because the scripture wouldn't add other stuff like that. But there's prophecies about the Messiah, the one that would do different things. And we look at those as Christians, like in Genesis, and say, well, that's obviously a prophecy about the Messiah. Modern day Judaism would say, no, it means something else. And you got the Dead Sea Scrolls saying, nah, it means Messiah. And that's what's fascinating about all of these things.
Yeah,
Well, in the commentary section, there's some really interesting ones. For instance, I remember going through seminary and we looked at the Valley of Dry Bones. And there were several theories on what it meant. Most of us thought it was prophecy, not resurrection. And some people said, well, it could be 537 BC coming back from Babylon, or 1948, or both. It could just be symbolic, that kind of thing. In the commentary in Ezekiel, though, they have a section on Ezekiel 37. And basically, they have two separate events where the same thing happens. One is when Israel comes back filled with the Spirit, and the other one is when they come back not filled with the Spirit. And so that's pretty obvious because they talk about the fact when they come back under Ezra, Nehemiah, that kind of stuff, they have 11Q13, this concept that the Messiah is God incarnate that dies for their sins. So they're obviously filled with the Spirit. They're following um, that kind of thing. And when Israel comes back in 1948, they're not messianic. So when you look at that, it's pretty obvious according to that text. Our Ezekiel 37 only has them coming back with not filled with the Spirit. So number one, that tells us that Ezekiel chapter 37 in our Bibles is specifically talking about 1948, period. And I thought that was fascinating. Anytime you can isolate something like that and know for sure, then you begin to see other things instead of speculating on what it might be, or it may prove something else to be wrong. So it's kind of neat to see that, this whole concept. And there's a lot of other things. For instance, in Habakkuk chapter 2, Paul quotes that in three places in the New Testament, and he's explaining how the just are saved by faith, not sacrifices, but faith in the Messiah. And he seems to indicate in Galatians that that's how Abraham was saved, by trusting in what the Messiah would do when he comes, however he fixes it. And so modern rabbis would say, no, it's got nothing to do with the Jesus or anything like that. It's just faith in God, that God will take care of things. Well, the commentary specifically says the just live by faith in what the teacher of righteousness will do when he comes. So they make it very, very clear. It can't be faith in potatoes or your church or whatever. It's faith in the Messiah. So
Hmm.
again, for us as Christians, it's very clear, but it's an incredible witness to Jews. The just live by faith. You can't live by the law of Moses. I mean, you need to follow that if you're in that culture, but that's not how salvation is based. It's by trusting Messiah. Well, who is Messiah? He's the one that was killed 40 years before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The one that did these other things, the one that is bringing salvation, that is God incarnate, that does all these things. And so it's repeated over and over again. And there is a ton of first coming prophecies, extra biblical ones, for instance, and then the commentaries on those. And then there are some that are for the second coming, which I find fascinating.